What happens when a superpower's careless gamble turns into a nightmare? In the bleak winter of 2025, Russia's audacious leap into Sumy became an unforgiving hellscape for its soldiers. The stillness of northern Ukraine, marked by a drawn-out, tense standoff, shattered as Ukrainian forces launched a fierce counterattack. This decisive strike proved devastating, crippling the Russian military along the Alexeyevko-Andreyevka line and transforming retreating units into conquerors trapped in a death spiral. With the capture of Andreyevka, the Ukrainian forces sent an unmistakable message: the north was thoroughly fortified, and no Russian advance would succeed. Reports flooded in, confirming that Ukrainian troops had wrestled Andreyevka back from Russian hands. This marked a dramatic turn. The Ukrainian army was undeniably on the offensive. To grasp this pivotal moment, we must delve into the strategic blunders of Moscow's leadership. Following a grueling push in Donbass that ran dry, Russian strategists devised a scheme to stretch Ukraine's defenses. The plan seemed sound. By reigniting hostilities from the northern border, they aimed to compel Kiev to divert experienced forces from the south, relieving pressure on Russian positions. Additionally, they hoped to restore menace to Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city. Unfortunately, two crucial miscalculations lay at the heart of this strategy. First, the Russian military lacked the troops and resources necessary for significant operations, a far cry from their capabilities in 2022. Second, the Ukrainian army had evolved dramatically, transforming from a static defense into a dynamic, clever force capable of springing intricate traps for unsuspecting foes. Rapidly, Russia's Sumy operation fell into a bloody standstill within weeks, entangled in Ukraine's fortified defenses and relentless artillery barrages. As casualties surged, Russian troops found themselves in perilous positions, their supply lines persistently targeted. What was meant to be a masterstroke instead ensnared its own soldiers. Amidst a complete breakdown of organization and rising panic, Putin's forces attempted desperate maneuvers to reclaim lost ground, launching offensives in the Sumy and Kursk regions. Yet these efforts were met with fierce Ukrainian counterattacks. The chaotic engagements revealed a grim reality: Russian units could not sustain their advances under the watchful eyes of Ukrainian drones, thwarting their every move. Caught in this web, Russian soldiers found themselves anxiously retreating towards northern Ukraine, yet it was too late. Ukrainian forces had watched, waited, and struck with lethal precision. Activating a high-speed armored division from Kindrativka, they created a small breach in Russian defenses. A single crack was all it took. The dam burst, and the entire structure fell apart. With their flanks wholly exposed, the chaos escalated. Ripple effects spread like wildfire as the Russian defense crumbled, giving way to a panic-stricken collapse and disorderly retreat. Ukrainian units seized the moment, cutting off retreat paths and encircling thousands of retreating soldiers in a deadly cauldron along the Andreyevko-Alexeyevka line. It transformed from mere territorial loss into a seismic shift in morale. Reports from the field depicted a horrifying reality where abandoned soldiers reported dwindling rations and despair. "We've been left behind. Our commanders have vanished," echoed desperate voices over distress signals. These haunting admissions captured a profound moral decline, where hunger and thirst triumphed over any determination to fight. As surrender and desertion attempted to spread like quicksilver among trapped troops, panic also permeated the ranks of Russian soldiers across the Sumy front. Fear gripped them. What if they suffered the same fate? What if their leaders would abandon them too? This burgeoning distrust proved more poisonous than bullets, corroding the very foundations of an army's will. This catastrophic defeat was not solely about the territories lost, it represented the unraveling of Russia's northern strategy. The implications rippled deep into the Kremlin, intensifying internal pressures to unprecedented levels. The victory for Ukraine wasn't merely reclaiming villages, it signaled their newfound momentum to project power into Russian territory. The fall of the Russian lines left cities like Belgorod and Kursk vulnerable. Where would the Kremlin turn? The options dwindled: withdraw forces from other fronts at the risk of amplifying chaos elsewhere, or allow Ukraine to traverse their territory unchecked, an unbearable blow to Putin's image. It was a stark choice, caught between humiliation and further collapse. With Sumy's grasp slipping, a new chapter of warfare emerged. Ukrainian strategy sharpened, blending military prowess with psychological warfare. They began to exploit the cracks within Russia's fabric, leveraging the sentiments of dissent and anger that had long surfaced. Partisan movements, once sidelined as mere symbols, were activated. These groups, Russian citizens opposing Putin, received covert support from Ukrainian intelligence, becoming instruments of internal strife. The retreating Russian army created an ideal opening, as chaos reigned in its ranks. As the dust settled, scenarios unfolded: bold fighters from the Legion of Freedom, crossing borders under the cover of artillery protection, ready to face the challenge of dismantling the regime from within. What would this daring gambit yield? A new era of conflict loomed on the horizon, one that might reshape the landscape of power between two nations forever. The Russian offensive in Sumy had spiraled into chaos, a deadly quagmire within mere weeks. Ukrainian forces, armed with unyielding defensive strategies, unleashed artillery barrages and drone strikes, turning the battlefield into a horror show. Russian troops found themselves ensnared in a perilous situation, their supply lines relentlessly battered. What had seemed like a brilliant strategic play by Putin became a trap that ensnared his own soldiers. In a desperate bid, the beleaguered Russian army launched counterattacks, attempting to reclaim lost villages around Sumy. On October 8th and 9th, they struck in the Kursk and Sumy regions, a move that sparked a fierce response from Ukrainian forces. The clashes, localized yet fierce, showcased the devastating capabilities of Ukrainian drones, effectively thwarting any Russian advance. The military pressure from Kiev mounted as Putin sought to stabilize his faltering front lines, committing his naval infantry units to the fray near Andriivka. The Ukrainian forces, waiting with bated breath, seized their moment. A swift operation from Kindrativka ignited the battle. This initial assault opened a breach in the Russian defenses, a crack that signaled something much more significant. It was akin to a dam giving way, the floodgates of chaos unleashed upon the unsuspecting Russian troops. With their flanks laid bare, the Russian defensive line began to collapse in a chain reaction. Panic spread like wildfire among the ranks, and what should have been a planned retreat devolved into uncoordinated mayhem. The true horror struck as the Ukrainian army launched a decisive offensive movement, cutting off escape routes for retreating Russian regiments. No longer simply backpedaling, this was a meticulously orchestrated encirclement. Ukrainian forces had effectively trapped them within villages along the Andriivka-Oleksiivka line, a death trap from which there was no easy escape. As the Russian regiments faced impending doom, the question loomed large: would they continue to fight without resources, or would resignation turn into surrender? Anxiety clawed at their morale, and many soldiers were left to ponder their fate amid the crumbling ranks and futile escape attempts. The air thickened with dread. The once proud might of the Russian army was now a frail shadow of its former self, teetering on the edge of disaster. With all avenues cut off, the Ukrainian army was relentless. Supplies, reinforcements, and hope faded for the trapped Russian soldiers as artillery and drones maintained their merciless watch above. In this hellish scenario, where despair reigned supreme, we are left to wonder, could this disaster lead to an even greater unraveling of Putin's military ambitions? In a pivotal moment during the ongoing conflict, chaos engulfed the Russian forces as their once sturdy defensive line in Ukraine crumbled like a house of cards. Faced with overwhelming pressure, the command structure disintegrated, sending waves of panic through the ranks. What was intended to be an organized withdrawal quickly devolved into a frantic scramble for survival. As Russian soldiers fled, the Ukrainian armored units sprang into action, cutting off their escape routes. They ensnared the retreating regiments, perfectly orchestrating a trapping maneuver around the villages and rural lands of Andriivka and Oleksiivka. This wasn't merely a retreat, it was a meticulously planned closure. Stranded, the Russian forces found themselves in a cauldron with no hope for reinforcements, ammunition, or even a morsel of food. Like a bird with clipped wings, they were left at the mercy of relentless Ukrainian drone strikes and artillery bombardments. The situation transformed from a military setback into a profound humanitarian crisis. Harrowing reports emerged from the 225th Separate Assault Battalion, detailing the despair faced by Russian troops trapped without sustenance or supplies. "We've had no food or water for days. Our commanders abandoned us and fled, we don't know what to do." These desperate communications painted a chilling picture of moral collapse, a modern army's ultimate failure. Soldiers could muster the strength to face their adversaries, but against starvation and the gnawing anxiety of betrayal, hopelessness took its toll. This despair triggered a wave of surrenders and desperate attempts to escape among the encircled troops. The chilling "I want to live" hotline became their sole lifeline, a thread of hope and hopelessness. As news of their plight spread, it ignited a panic across the broader Sumy front among Russian forces. Doubts crept in: what if we're next? What if our leaders forsake us too? Such thoughts gnawed at their collective psyche, eroding their will to fight more effectively than any enemy fire. This was the Kremlin's worst nightmare realized, a psychological collapse that threatened to sweep through the entire army. The loss of morale paralleled the loss of territory, signaling not just a failure on the battlefield but a critical fracture in the spirit of the Russian military establishment. The situation in Sumy became emblematic of the broader challenges faced by Russia, raising the stakes for future engagements and the very fabric of Putin's military strategy. What happens when an army loses faith in its leaders? Are those whispers of betrayal merely the beginning of a far greater crisis? In the aftermath of the battle in Sumy, the air is thick with despair and uncertainty among Russian soldiers. Whispers of retaliation echo like haunting specters through the ranks. What if we're next? What if our leaders abandon us too? These thoughts creep in like shadows, eroding morale faster than any enemy fire. This incalculable anxiety strikes fear into the heart of the Kremlin, igniting concerns that the cracks in their forces will lead to an overwhelming tide of desertion and revolt. The defeat suffered in Sumy extends beyond mere territorial losses. It represents the collapse of the Russian army's spirit and strategy in the north. As the Ukrainian forces press their advantage, their victory illuminates a path to the heart of Russia itself. The situation has rendered border cities like Belgorod and Kursk vulnerable to potential incursions, amplifying the Kremlin's dilemma. With the Russian military position compromised, Putin faces stark choices. Should he divert essential troops from other conflict zones, such as Donbass or Crimea, to fortify the north, risking further collapses elsewhere? Or should he gamble on his northern defenses, potentially inviting chaos onto Russian soil? Either option bears the weight of humiliation for a leader who has constructed his image on an unwavering stronghold. In this high-stakes game that began in Sumy, Putin's ambitions crumble as the unexpected consequence of his strategy sends shockwaves through an already beleaguered military. The fluttering flags in Oleksievka and Andriivka symbolize more than just military victories. They herald a shift in the war's dynamics, launching it into a perilous and unpredictable phase, one devoid of Putin's imperial aspirations. As the dust settles, the battlefield is reshaped not just by the clash of arms but by a psychological and political war simmering just beneath the surface. For months, Ukraine has patiently observed the growing discontent within Russia, ready to exploit internal fractures. With newfound momentum, Ukraine is not merely defending, it actively seeks to destabilize the shattered regime through tactics that turn Russia's own strategies back on itself. Imagine several hundred fighters from the Legion of Freedom, Russian citizens opposing the Kremlin, making a decisive move under the cover of artillery fire from their Ukrainian allies. The implications are staggering. Their actions could kindle flames of dissent within Russia, leading to political chaos that erodes the Kremlin's grip on power. This chapter of the conflict marks a striking shift, raising questions of loyalty and survival among Russian forces. Will they stand firm, or will the specter of rebellion grow too potent to resist? The backdrop of desperation intertwines with the scent of fear and the palpable tension of what lies ahead. Only time will reveal the true cost of this unfolding drama. Ukraine's triumph in Sumy not only reclaimed stolen lands, but also ushered Putin's conflict into a far more perilous stage, where his imperial fantasies find no foothold. Yet, this win doesn't merely pose a battlefield puzzle or a border issue for Moscow, it's unraveling something deeper, more treacherous. What sinister weapon from Russia's own arsenal is now turning back against them, igniting a shadow war that could shatter Putin from within? Imagine waking up to the roar of artillery, the acrid stink of gunpowder clinging to your skin, and whispers of rebellion echoing through darkened alleys, a reality that's fast becoming Russia's nightmare. Picture this chilling flashback. In the frostbitten dawn of 2014, the Donbass air thick with the metallic tang of fresh snow and the thunderous boom of propaganda-spewing loudspeakers, Ukrainian forces first tasted the bitterness of invasion. The cold wind bit into exposed flesh, carrying the distant scent of burning villages, as separatists hoisted flags like puppets on strings. That was Putin's playbook, turning neighbors into enemies with promises of self-rule. Now, flash forward to the present, where those same tactics are boomeranging, fueled by months of Kiev's silent observation. Ukraine has spotted Russia's fractures, simmering rage beneath the surface, dissent stifled like a choking fog in a sealed room, voices labeled as betrayal by a paranoid regime. Kiev's strike in Sumy carved out a void, exposing Russian weaknesses like a gaping wound bled dry by relentless drone swarms and artillery hail. No longer confined to tanks and cannons, Ukraine counters with a twisted irony, wielding Moscow's own tools, separatism's siren call, self-determination's bait, and the seductive myth of people's republics. This darkest twist in the saga mocks Putin's schemes, flipping the script on his 2014 gambit with cruel precision. At the core of this audacious gambit? Fighters not from Ukraine's soil, but Russians themselves, rising as phantoms against their tyrant. Groups like the Legion of Freedom of Russia, the Siberian Battalion, and the Russian Volunteer Corps, once mere footnotes, scattered and symbolic, have evolved under the GUR's discreet tutelage. Quiet drills in forested shadows, the clink of weapons cached in hidden bunkers, the sweat-soaked exhaustion of training under starless skies, all orchestrated over the past year to forge these units into Ukraine's hidden edge. For Kiev, they're no hired swords, but clever infiltrators, Trojan horses smuggling chaos into Russia's veins. Political dynamite, rigged to detonate from the inside out. And now, with Sumi's defenses crumbling in panicked retreat, soldiers trampling each other in stampedes, radios crackling with frantic pleas, the moment has arrived. The Ukrainian command issues an unprecedented signal: unleash these wolves across the border. Not for conquest or control, but to sow upheaval, rattle Moscow's grip on its homeland, and mirror that filthy 2014 narrative right onto Putin's own twisted face. What if the invaders became the invaders' own undoing? As Legion fighters slink past slackened sentries, the earth trembling under Ukrainian shellfire? Do you hear the distant sirens wailing in Belgorod? Smell the smoke of burning checkpoints as they plant flags of dissent, their boots crunching over littered rubble. Is this the spark for Russia's internal inferno, or just the prelude to something even more explosive? As the dust settles on a tumultuous battlefield, a significant shift unfolds in the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. The events in Sumy reveal a brutal reality that starkly contrasts the Kremlin's ambitions. In January 2025, amidst the uncertainty of war, a daring counterattack by Ukrainian forces shattered Russian hopes, trapping their troops in a perilous situation. Imagine a synchronous dance of fate as Ukraine allied its firepower and intelligence against Russian forces. The moment Ukrainian soldiers liberated Andriivka became a watershed. The enemy faced an insurmountable challenge, a quintessential tale of strength meeting calculated precision. With heavy artillery and vigilant drones, Ukraine secured the northern front, signaling Russia's dire predicament. Just days before a catastrophic collapse, Russian commanders ordered their forces to establish a foothold, unaware they were moving into a trap set months in advance. Together, the Ukrainian army and its innovative strategies transformed the landscape. A well-laid ambush morphed into a cataclysmic snare for the Russian military. The sound of artillery echoed as one Ukrainian unit launched a swift operation, which was like a match striking a torch in the dark. With that initial strike, the defenses crumbled, exposing flanks and signifying the end of Russian control. Yet, amidst this chaos loomed the specter of desperation. As news of the dire plight of trapped soldiers spread, despair permeated the ranks, whispers of abandonment instigating fear. Imagine the chilling silence on the radio as soldiers murmured, "We are without supplies, left to our own devices." This was no ordinary fallout, it was a profound moral crisis, rendering soldiers powerless against hunger and thirst, as betrayals unraveled their spirits. Reports revealed soldiers surrendering, not out of cowardice, but the sheer will to survive. The aftermath of the Sumy debacle brought about clarity. The Kremlin's grasp weakened, and with internal tumult brewing, an unexpected resistance movement began forming from within. Perhaps the most audacious strategy emerged. Ukrainian forces turned to their own version of insurgency, employing Russian dissidents, those disenchanted with Putin's regime. Now, let's visualize a scenario rooted in this chaotic atmosphere. Under the watchful eye of Ukrainian artillery, members of the Legion of Freedom stealthily crossed into Russian territory. They seized a border town, hoisting white-blue-white flags in place of the national emblem. From the town hall, they boldly proclaimed, "We are the freedom fighters of the Belgorod People's Republic, marching against the corruption that drags our people into ruin." Consider the thunderous implications of these words, each one a dagger aimed at the heart of Kremlin propaganda. This defiance mirrored the very narratives Putin spun years ago to justify his own military endeavors. The irony weighed heavily. Should Putin respond with force against this uprisings, he would unveil the grisly truth of waging war on his own citizens. On the other hand, hesitating to act could signal weakness and admission that he no longer controlled his narrative or his territory. This revelation of a broader strategy reveals a battlefield far more intricate than mere tactical advantages, opening a Pandora's box that could shift the tides of war. As the fight for hearts and minds escalates, the foundations of Putin's power tremble. Ukraine's victory in Sumy becomes not just a pivotal military triumph, but the precursor to an insurrection that could change the course of history. In a devastating setback for the Kremlin, Ukraine's triumph in Sumy exposed Putin's feeble grasp on his borders, creating a gateway to a deeper, more insidious battle. This epic victory has unleashed a storm, transforming the conflict from brutal trench warfare into a cunning psychological offensive aimed straight at Russia's fragile heart, its deep ethnic divides and simmering internal rifts. Imagine the air thick with tension, the distant rumble of artillery like thunder over snow-covered fields, where the bitter cold bites into exposed skin, forcing fighters to clutch their weapons tighter for warmth. No longer does Ukraine fantasize about storming Moscow with relentless tanks. Instead, they've turned Russia's own people into unstoppable forces, wielding shared grievances and divisive tactics as covert blades to dismantle the regime from the inside. Putin ignited this inferno to erase Ukraine's existence, shattering its spirit and claiming its land. But in a cruel twist of fate, his ruthless crusade has backfired, sparking a chain reaction that threatens to fracture the Russian Federation at its core, raising haunting doubts about its unity and destiny. Picture the war slinking back to Putin's doorstep, not just with buzzing drones or exploding missiles that scorch the air with acrid smoke, but with ideas that spread like wildfire through whispered conversations in dimly lit bunkers. The most lethal weapon now? The realization that even fellow Russians can rise against the tyrants in charge. And this dark revelation could prove deadlier than any advanced hypersonic weapon, its echo reverberating like a forbidden melody promising liberation or chaos. What if the very soldiers meant to conquer abroad now question their emperor's throne? A shocking fact, this asymmetric war isn't just reclaiming land, it's turning Russian citizens into mirrors of their own hypocrisy, forcing Putin to face the monster he's unleashed. As panic grips the air, the pungent scent of sweat-soaked uniforms in claustrophobic hideouts mixes with the metallic tang of blood on frozen earth, where every shadow hides betrayal. Is the Kremlin's iron grip slipping, crushed under the weight of its own contradictions? In this finale, the borders blur, and the true invasion begins not with boots on ground, but with minds awakened, leaving Putin's empire teetering on the edge of irreversible fragmentation. The horizon darkens with uncertainty, urging, can a nation forged in deceit withstand the truth it spawned? N'Gung.